It's a pleasure to be with all of you again. As I always do, I want to extend my gratitude to our development staff and our communication staff for giving us the ability and the voice during these difficult times to actually fulfill our mission as a policy school and to be able to get to our communities to make their lives better for all. That is extremely important to us, to the faculty and my colleagues at the Price School. But one of our more important missions, frankly, is to support our students and making sure that they matriculate in one of the best schools in the world, and they do. And today I have with me one of our MPA students who so graciously agreed to come on and actually talk about a policy topic which is near and dear certainly to my heart, as I have written about this topic before in a couple of articles in 2017 and 2018. And the effect of this, even though we are all focused on COVID-19 and its effect directly, but there are other policy arenas that actually affect what we do as local governments and governments. And this particular topic that we're going to discuss today clearly has an impact, particularly in California and in our Southern California communities. Many of you, mayors and council members, are on this call, on this Zoom call, to listen. So without further ado, I'm going to Nena to come on and provide an update on the topic of today, which is the DACA policy issue that actually affects us all. And unfortunately has been politicized before, but here we're going to talk about policy and our academic standpoint on the issue and why it is important to focus on this issue, particularly in light of COVID, and Nena is going to get to that, and Jennifer as well. So before I get to Jennifer, however, Nena, why don't you provide us a little bit of background information on DACA, because some of our folks may or may not know what exactly it comes from, the executive orders that were signed on this topic, the background law that exists on the books, which we'll get to Jennifer in just a second. But let's start providing our audience here basic information on DACA. Nena.
Thank you, Frank. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint to share with everyone. So what is DACA? DACA stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it was established under the Obama administration in June 2012 by executive order, as Frank said. And later on, we're going to talk about why this is kind of an issue. So when Obama signed DACA and enacted DACA, DHS issued a memo. The link is here. And in this memo, DHS is explaining what ICE needs to do or not do, depending on if these undocumented individuals qualify for DACA. So this basically says not to deport individuals who qualified for DACA. And so what DACA basically does is it provides temporary relief from deportation to those who came to the US illegally as minors. So that's what DACA is in a nutshell. Requirements and implementations. This information came from Daniela Alulima, Director of Programs, Center for Migration Studies of New York. And in order to qualify for DACA, you must show continuous presence in the US since June 15th, 2007. You also need to meet a certain age requirement. You need to be under 31 as of June 15, 2012. You needed to have arrived in the US before 16, and you need to be at least 15 years old to have applied for DACA. You must show physical proof that physical presence in the US on June 15, 2012. You must have an unlawful status. You must be enrolled or graduated from high school or have a GED in place of that. Or you can also be an honorably discharged veteran from the armed forces. And you also need to show good moral character as evidenced by no serious convictions on your record. In order to apply for DACA, applicants are required to pay a $495 fee, and that's including biometrics. Biometrics would be things like fingerprints, background checks, etc. Recipients were required to renew their work permits every 2 years in order to maintain their ability to stay in the country without fearing deportation and to be able to work legally. By the way, this $495 fee. USCIS is considering increasing this fee to about $795, but that's just in the talks right now. Okay, so what DACA offers essentially is 2-year protection from deportation, renewable 2-year work permit, social security card and or number, a state driver's license, recipients must pay taxes, and recipients are not entitled to federal benefits, and DACA recipients are also not allowed to vote, to cast their votes in federal elections. Currently, there are about 880,000 active DACA recipients in the US. And just keep in mind that throughout the research, I found that this number here varied. It's usually between 650,000 and 700,000. But again, the data does vary in this number. So DACA recipients come from over 158 countries. However, these top 10 countries are most commonly where DACA recipients originate from, the most common being our neighboring country, Mexico, with 80%, and it goes all the way down to Argentina. So again, they come from 158 countries. So who are they? So this is the data I found. So 47% are male, 53% are female. The most common age group seems to be between 21 and 25, followed by 26 and 30, and some marital status. So these are just some demographics, just based on the data that's available. And DACA recipients do live all over the United States. However, these states have the majority being California. But essentially, DACA recipients live all over the United States. Okay, so the Center for American Progress found that 91% of DACA recipients are currently employed across the country, and 72% of the top 25 Fortune 500 companies employ DACA recipients. So that would include companies like Walmart, Amazon, AT&T, etc. Okay. And here's some history, and here's where we're going to end the first part of the presentation. So since 2001, there have been about 21 different versions and revisions of the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act is not the same as DACA, however, but DACA did come way after that. None have been enacted into law. So the last time the DREAM Act came up in Congress was in December 2010, and it did fail by a small margin. Again, this is just to give you some history of the policy and the events that led up to developing DACA. DACA has been the closest legalization program since the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. This link here is a very useful link. It describes all the versions that have been brought into Congress since 2001. This is a very useful link. I highly encourage individuals to look into this. We obviously only have an hour. We can't talk about all 21 versions, but this link is very useful in breaking down every version of the DREAM Act. Okay, and I will end it here.
Thank you, Nena. That's great. I think that was a very comprehensive look at the DACA. But I find your next to last slide very powerful and influential, frankly, especially for the discussion we're going to have a little later about how this affects COVID-19, because your percentages are that 91% of these folks are employed, and 72% employed at the top level by Fortune 500 companies, which I think is extremely important in discussing policy, especially post-COVID-19, where the economy needs to be has been uprooted and now needs to be put back together, and how these folks are going to be so important in the process. So we'll get back to that in just a second. Jennifer, thank you for joining us as well. Jennifer's a lawyer in our Gould School of Law immigration center that we have, and they all are very able lawyers to deal with this particular issue and other immigration issues. But Jennifer, I think what I wanted to discuss with you perhaps very quickly is kind of the state of the law as it exists today, because we've been dealing with DACA on the basis of something that is not law necessarily. It's kind of a substitute for law with executive action. So, which is not the greatest way to do policy, because Article 1 of our Constitution certainly grants that power to the legislative branch of our government, and certainly not to Article 2, which is our executive branch. But executive branches have been kind of putting their nose into this, rightfully, wrongfully. That's not the issue. But really, it's about legislation. What is the current law as we have it today?
So as of right now, I'm going to back up a little bit. So DACA is currently pending. The status of DACA is currently pending at the Supreme Court. There's no law or any way that current DACA recipients can adjust their status by solely being DACA recipients or dreamers. The only way that current DACA recipients can adjust their status is either through humanitarian reasons, employment-based reasons, or family-based reasons. And one of the ways that primarily DACA recipients adjust their status is through family petitions, which means that they need to have a U.S. citizen spouse, parent, or child over the age of 21. But then they later run into other issues because of how they entered the country, whether they've accrued something that's called unlawful presence.
Jennifer, actually, I also wanted you to tell our audience about the executive orders that have been signed, whether it was the Obama administration or the Trump administration. They were based on an existing law, right? But that law dates back to several years back, correct? I think it's Bush administration.
I'm sorry, I'm a little, which law are you referring to?
The overall immigration law.
Oh, yes. Our overall immigration law system, yes. It's based on, prosecutorial discretion, which gives the executive branch relied on prosecutorial discretion in order to proceed with DACA.
Correct. And the Supreme Court decision that you're talking about is actually to look at this administration's executive order rescinding DACA on the basis of the regulatory issues that may be underlying that executive order. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So, and when is that Supreme Court decision, by the way, supposed to come out?
So it's supposed to come out by the end of June.
Okay, and just give us a kind of a preview of what happens if they say yes and what happens if they say no.
Okay, so there's three possible decisions. So first, there's two questions at the Supreme Court. The first question is whether the Supreme Court can even review the termination or the decision to terminate. And secondly, the second is whether the program was actually lawful. So the first possible thing that the Supreme Court can do is say that it can't review Trump's decision to terminate DACA. And it will say that the Supreme Court doesn't have the legal authority to review the government's decision to end DACA, and that the current injunctions that allow people to file DACA renewals are not valid. Secondly, the court can conclude that it may review the administration's decision to terminate DACA and ultimately determine that the termination was unlawful. And lastly, which is one of the decisions that a lot of practitioners believe is the one that's most likely, is that the court will conclude that it can review the decision and it will decide that the termination of DACA is lawful. However, that causes, a lot of anticipation as to how the program will be terminated, considering that there's so many people that rely on this program and actively have cases pending at USCIS. They have recently renewed their DACA and have it currently pending until 2022. So those are the three possible outcomes.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's great. And I'm going to come back to you. Actually, to be honest, none of those outcomes potentially may be that bad in light of what I am going to come back to you in a few minutes after I talk to Nena just a second about the effect of DACA on post-COVID economy. But really, I mean, we're looking for a sound law in Congress on this topic, which may, one of these possibilities, force ultimately in Congress. But I'm going to come back to that in terms of what are the weaknesses of the current law and what can Congress do in just a minute. Nena, back to you. So tell us a little bit more about this policy topic, how you envision this applying to post-COVID economy, and what are the pluses and minuses of this, and what should our local leaders do, really, who are listening to us that may have DACA recipients in their communities. And I'll ask the same question a little later after we talk about additional law, but what they can do to Jennifer. Well, let's start with you, Nena.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my slides again. So how does this policy relate to the current pandemic, as Frank was asking? The big question I think a lot of us have is, what will the U.S. economy look like after COVID-19? When I did research, I really couldn't find what the U.S. economy would look like after COVID-19. That might be a little too soon to tell, but what I did find was how municipal or local governments look like they're going to face a lot of fiscal challenges ahead post-COVID-19. For example, $7 billion in revenue might be lost for California local governments over the next 2 years, assuming that these stay-at-home orders are lifted by June 1st. And this number could grow depending on how long these stay-at-home orders last. Again, a lot of these things are really hard to predict. I posted the links here for that article. Also, LA City, Mayor Garcetti is proposing a $230 million cut from the city budget. So that's just to kind of give us a picture of Los Angeles City, just to give us a picture of how a local government might really struggle to get back on their feet financially post-COVID-19. And I'll explain how this relates to DACA. So prior to COVID-19, there has already been data exploring what would happen if we were to remove these DACA recipients from the U.S. economy. For example, if they weren't able to work legally because of the rescinding of DACA. So studies have found, and numerous studies actually share these similar numbers, $280 billion would be lost in economic growth over the next 10 years. And $60 billion, although we're not going to really talk about deportation, but let's imagine worst case scenario. If we were to deport DACA recipients, that would cost U.S. taxpayers $60 billion and the federal government. So these are big numbers. And again, these numbers were prior to COVID-19. They might be different now that COVID-19 has taken a toll on our economy. So there are two arguments to be made here. There's an economic argument that I found during my research, and I also found a moral and ethical argument during my research. I'm going to start with the economic argument first, and that is, without DACA recipients' contributions, again, we stand to lose $280 billion in economic growth over the next decade. We're also going to we could lose $60 billion in tax revenue. This $60 billion is not to be confused with the $16 billion it would cost to deport DACA recipients. Same number, two different issues. Again, 72% of the top 25 Fortune 500 companies employ DACA recipients. Now, if DACA were to be rescinded and DACA recipients had to leave the workforce, that would cost about $3.4 to $6 billion employers in worker turnover cost. And we also have DACA recipients who own businesses, and they happen to employ 8 million Americans. But please note that Americans here, the research did not say if they were citizens or not. They just said Americans. So we don't know the demographics of this term Americans here. But apparently DACA recipients who own businesses, collectively, they employ 8 million Americans. Okay, so again, if we were to lose DACA recipients' contributions to our economy, our Social Security and Medicare tax contributions would be cut by $24.6 billion. There would be a reduction to Social Security, and that loss would be $19.9 billion, and there would be a reduction to Medicare contributions. We could stand to lose $4.6 billion in that area. Again, this is all based on the research that I looked up. Okay. And here is the moral and ethical argument. This is a quote from, again, Daniela Alolima. DACA opened the door to over 650,000 young immigrants who are Americans in every way but legal status. So the moral argument here, there are 3 points I'm going to make. Not all of this is my original thought. A lot of this was pulled from the research that I conducted. So the first point to make is that each US citizen is ultimately a descendant from someone who took the risk to walk over a bridge, run across a desert, swim, sail, or fly here to the United States, with the exception of Native Americans, of course. Our country, the United States, has been and continues to be built by immigrants. And the DACA and the DACA/Dreamers program is giving some of those current children who of undocumented immigrants a chance to follow in those footsteps. Policymakers told these children that if they registered for DACA, deportation would be deferred on their behalf. We gave them a work permit so they can go to work. We gave them a driver's license so they can drive to work. And we gave them a social security number so that they can contribute taxes. Policymakers invited DACA recipients to come out of the shadows and trust us. So taking away that promise now would say what? My second point is that before anything else, we must remember that DACA recipients are people and they have embedded themselves into US society, the only home most of them have ever known, according to the data. Without appropriate policy from Congress, excluding DACA recipients from this fabric would punch holes in our economy, in our healthcare system, and the workforce in general, also according to the data. So my message to Congress, or the message that Congress should be hearing, is to not let these undocumented taxpayers go back into the shadow. And last but not least, do not leave US citizens in the shadows waiting for immigration reform to happen. We have waited long enough. As some of you may be familiar with Emma Lazarus's poem that is on the plaque on the Statue of Liberty. It says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." That poem. That finally leads me to my last point and my last question, which is, respecting the US Constitution is important, but as policymakers, what about respecting our values as a country and demonstrating that respect through policy? Okay. Lastly, these are some resources that anyone can look at for more information on DACA, on immigration policy. As a US citizen, myself, I believe it's very critical to understand the citizenship laws in my country. So uscis.gov is an excellent source for anyone to log on to and look at these citizenship laws and immigration laws. Everything there is on this website. Again, I highly encourage everyone watching to please look at this website and inform yourselves. And that's it.
Thank you, Nena. That was very thoughtful of you. And I certainly understand all of the arguments you make. And frankly, I will go one step above by saying that there's nothing against the Constitution by actually legislating immigration policy, which is what we're lacking in. To me, it's not both the moral argument. To me, it's not only a moral argument, it's certainly a legal argument as well, that it is important to adjust people's statuses, which we do all the time for various reasons. And especially for these people, most of whom have come at an age where they themselves could not make a legal decision because they were under the age of 18 to begin with. So it's kind of strange to hold them to a level of legal equivalency when we don't accept their legal decisions under the age of 18, yet hold them responsible for the conduct. That's a little interesting to me. I've always wondered about that. But Jennifer, let me come back to you and ask you about what can we do as far as the legislation is concerned. The Article 1 of our Constitution gives that power to our Congress. In one of my articles, I've said enough is enough. Congress, get your act together, legislate. Do not let these one-off, ad hoc executive orders to be going up and down the chain of Article 3 judges. There's no point in doing this. Why don't you legislate? If they do, what should they do?
Well, I think most importantly, there has to be comprehensive immigration reform, not only for current DACA recipients and folks who could have been DACA recipients, but for all undocumented folks in the United States. But specifically right now, to help DACA recipients, one of the legislation specifically that would help them is the DREAM Act, which is currently pending in the Senate. And if that isn't passed, there's a possibility to change current immigration law in order to benefit not only DACA recipients, but other immigrants who are affected by different pieces of the INA that make them ineligible to adjust their status. For example, one example is a part of the INA that says that when someone accrues unlawful presence in the United States for over 6 months to a year and over a year, and then they leave the country, they accrue a 3-year or a 10-year bar. There's a possibility of applying for a waiver, but there's a huge risk in leaving the United States to go to a consular interview and try to become a lawful permanent resident. And this is a risk that a lot of people are not willing to take, because once you leave the country, there can be a possibility that a consular office can find another reason why you can't immigrate to the United States. So I feel like one of the things that can change is possibly that specific part of the INA, which is the Immigrant Nationality Act.
And to be clear, none of us are advocating the violation of our laws or the sovereignty of the United States of America. None of us are advocating that this should be a lawless way of approaching immigration. All we're suggesting here is a cogent immigration policy that deals with the immigration issue. The United States has all the right to allow or not allow certain people to come in, immigrate or not immigrate. That is clear. And I think all laws will clearly indicate that. And none of us are advocating for some sort of a free-for-all here. It's all about being constitutional and legal and acting on our Constitution to create that law. Jennifer, last but not least, perhaps, I know at USC we have resources, and our local leaders who are perhaps on the line with us would love to share that resource and other resources that may be available to these folks who are extremely important. And I'll come back as I conclude as to why, to make the point one more time that Nena has made. But what resources do we have at USC? What other resources are there for mayors and council members from various of our jurisdictions to send people to so that they are legally represented and or well-informed?
So at USC, we have the USC Immigration Clinic, which has 4 different projects. So we have a removal defense clinic where law students represent individuals who are currently detained in immigration detention. We have an appellate project where students help immigrants appeal their denials of relief in immigration court up to the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. We have a citizenship project where we help the USC community and the community at large to become US citizens. And finally, my project is the Immigrant Legal Assistance Center, where I provide free, confidential legal consultations regarding immigration law to members of the USC community, which means I provide free legal consultations to students, staff, faculty, and their family members. And other universities also have similar legal centers.
And are you aware of any other not-for-profits or other organizations that may be out there that people can refer folks to?
Yes, there's a lot. So in Los Angeles, there's a lot of resources for undocumented folks to get legal consultations. Nena shared one of them, which is Chirla. Another one is Carecen. They provide also legal services to folks in Los Angeles.
That is great. And I certainly advise and recommend to folks who are watching us now and will be watching us to absolutely refer your DACA members to resources so that they are well informed, they are well represented by lawyers who actually master this topic, as Jennifer has in our community. But that doesn't mean that your community or your other schools or other universities don't have similar resources, as Jennifer mentioned. And more importantly, that you make sure that this very important group of people are able to do what they continue to do. And frankly, for most of the folks who are online with me will understand this, is that we need able bodies in the United States, and we need able bodies post-COVID, particularly to actually revamp our economy and work so that our pensions don't suffer. Ultimately, what's going to happen if we don't have enough young people to work for the older people, because that's how the economy works. The older people have worked during their time and have gotten where they are. Now it's the turn of the younger people to work for the older people. That's how the pension system works. That's how Social Security works. That's how our communities, especially cities and counties with pension systems, work. So to deny a bunch of young people a right to work and ability to work, it actually is cutting our nose despite our face. So it is an important topic. I'm delighted that Nena and Jennifer came on today to speak about this topic. We're running out of time, and it's very important for us as a policy school to discuss these policies so that we make sure that our communities across California and the nation are exposed to very important topics that affects us all. DACA affects us all. This is not just a them issue or us issue. This is not a red issue or a blue issue or a Republican or a Democrat issue. This is an American issue. Nena, anything more to add?
Yes, actually, I forgot to mention that since the rescinding of DACA, parts of that policy did change. So, for example, prior to the rescinding of DACA, there was something called advanced parole, which allowed DACA recipients to leave the United States and then return to the United States freely as they wanted. Since DACA has been rescinded, DACA recipients are no longer allowed to leave the United States, and no new applications are currently being accepted. That's a very critical part of the policy that's changed, and I just wanted to share that. Yeah, and I also thought about sanctuary cities, something more that our local leaders could do. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A if it comes up, but having sanctuary cities isn't enough. It's also a Band-Aid to the issue, and I think it is in our best interest to advocate to Congress and our larger government to provide more adequate law and not have to put these cities or local leaders in a position to make a sanctuary city. Meanwhile, the issue is still going on elsewhere. So I just wanted to add that.
Fair enough. I think there's a lot of discussion about one way or the other about sanctuary cities and the legality of such conduct one way or the other. And it's been politicized, unfortunately. But having said that, again, that in and of itself does not solve the problem. As I suggested before and in my articles as well, it's less than even a Band-Aid as far as I'm concerned. It just doesn't do anything. It's a more of a in the context of political context, much more than the legal context, because frankly, we don't have many tools to be able to protect against federal authority and federal jurisdiction in that context from a legal standpoint. So it kind of gives false hope the way I've written about this before. I prefer very solidly that we have solid legislation in the Article 1 section of our Constitution, where the legislation will come from Congress that will deal with this issue rather than Band-Aids that really don't work that well at all. Jennifer, any comments, any final thoughts?
I just wanted to add that if you're a current DACA recipient, you should renew as soon as possible, regardless of when, even if your employment authorization document expires next year, it's highly suggested that you renew, because we don't know what the Supreme Court is gonna do with DACA. So in case, employment authorization documents are allowed to continue until they expire, it is something that we highly recommend that people do.
Great. Lawyers being lawyers, I always will also say that consult your own, because your own case might be a little different. So please consult lawyers. Whether it's Jennifer, if you're in the USC community or you're outside of our community, always consult lawyers to make sure that your particular case is addressed the proper way. So Harley, back to you.
Sounds good. All right, so I have some questions from our audience, and if anybody else has any, please feel free to send them into the Q&A. So I will go through these in order. First one is, do you think with high unemployment that they will want to give legal status and create more competition to citizens looking for jobs?
Nena, why don't we start with you? And I certainly can tackle some of it if I understand the question correctly, but go ahead.
So in my research, I didn't come across any data that, it's a great question and it's a very valid question. I didn't come across anything in my research that suggested that there is any competition between DACA recipients and citizens. To be honest, I'm not sure. I didn't come across it in my research. I didn't find anything that suggests that there is competition between these two groups, between U.S. citizens and DACA recipients.
That's fair enough, Nena. And the other issue is that the research clearly shows that these folks are already employed to begin with, right? And
right,
presumably, they're also part of people who have lost jobs too,
correct.
Right? I mean, it doesn't mean that somehow they're going to be avoiding DACA recipients in furloughing them or something like that. So I think the unemployment, it will be across the board, whether DACA or otherwise. And again, these folks, please, let's remember that these folks have been working here all their lives.
Yes.
I mean, all their adult lives. Some of them are in our best universities. Some of them are valedictorians. Some of them are going to law school, a medical school, etc. So we're not talking about people who are not being productive. They are already being productive, and they're part of a bigger population. Very important, again, that we tap young and willing people to work into our working population. Jennifer, anything to add to that question?
No, I don't have it.
Actually, and to add on to you, Frank, since, like you said, DACA recipients have been working their whole lives here, if there is competition between a U.S. citizen and a DACA recipient, I would say it's probably not much different than the competition you experience when you go to an interview with other U.S. citizens. Every time you apply for a job, there's always competition. So there's that. But,
Okay, I'll keep going. Yep. Next question is, what are the potential ramifications for current DACA recipients who have since married a U.S. citizen and have subsequently given birth to children should DACA policy be rescinded?
Jennifer, that's more you than us.
Oh, and there's a follow-up to that. And have been law-abiding, gainfully employed, tax-paying non-citizens.
Okay, so even though a DACA recipient may marry a U.S. citizen, I mean, each person's case is different, and they need to consult an attorney before, proceeding with any type of application or petition. Each DACA recipient's case is different, and even though they marry a U.S. citizen, it doesn't mean that their pathway to citizenship will be particularly easy, because there's a lot of factors that come into play. One of the factors is how they entered the United States, which will mean whether they can adjust their status here in the United States or they have to leave the country, and that could even affect them more. So there's no clear way to say, marrying a U.S. citizen is a sure way to be able to become a resident, because immigration law is very complicated and there's different factors that can affect their ability to eventually become a lawful permanent resident.
Next question is, there seems to be a lot of advocacy surrounding DACA. It's not a permanent solution, does not offer a pathway to citizenship. Is it more valuable to advocate for other legislation that does offer a pathway to citizenship? And what pending legislation should we advocate for?
I would say yes, but that's up to you. I think that's up to every person. If you feel that there should be a legal pathway to citizenship for this group, then advocate for that. Again, this is an informational session. It's just to provide information on DACA. However, I believe that every person should advocate for their own interests. So if you personally feel that there should be different legislation, better legislation, et cetera, that is up to you to advocate for personally. However, as we have been suggesting throughout this webinar, we do need more, I believe Professor Zerunyan said, cogent legislation. So just something that's concrete, something that's effective, something that works, something that can satisfy the population of dreamers, but of course also the US citizens. That's what we're suggesting here, but would anyone else like to add anything?
There is a current DREAM Act of 2019 that passed the House, and it's currently pending at the Senate.
And that says what, Jennifer?
It directs the Department of Homeland Security to cancel the removal and grant lawful permanent resident status on a conditional basis to individuals who are undocumented, who are inadmissible or deportable, or in a temporary status, who have been continuously present in the United States for 4 years preceding the bill's enactment, were younger than the age of 18 upon their initial entry to the United States, are not inadmissible based on various grounds related to crime or security, and have fulfilled certain educational requirements.
And that, is there a path to citizenship there as well, or not?
Yes, because they become a conditional permanent resident based on that, and eventually a permanent resident and then citizen.
Yeah, and on this topic, I'll just add to it. I'll up you both a little bit here. I don't consider it advocacy in my judgment because I'm on the record. I've written about this before. I can't think of a better group than the DACA recipients to have a path to citizenship. I can't think of a better Americans, ultimately, those that are valedictorians or that attend our universities, that do everything what the American dream provides. So I have no trouble saying it. As I said, I'm not necessarily suggesting to any of you that I don't believe in sovereignty of the nation. Quite the contrary is true. I believe very much in the sovereignty of the United States, and the United States definitely has a right to say yes and no to people that come and go. But that being said, this particular group, highly educated, living the American dream, I can't think of a better way. In fact, I wrote in my article that if anybody had the guts on both sides of the aisle, they would do a clean bill just for DACA. That's it. But that would require major political courage on both sides, because there'll be no jockeying and there'll be no horse trading, because that's what happens, immigration bills. There's horse trading all the time about you give me this, I give you that kind of a thing. DACA should not be played with as far as I'm concerned. DACA should be on its own. These are great people. They're the best Americans we can get. So, and I'm not suggesting that, you know, we don't have great people. Obviously, we're great. I'm an American exceptionalist. I always say it. But that being said, these are deserving folks that definitely need a cogent, as I always say, immigration bill that would get them to a citizenship. As to the rest, I have various other opinions about the rest. I'm not suggesting that I believe in path to citizenship for every case, but DACA, yes.
I'm not sure if we know the answers to this one, but do we know the percentage of DACA that have entered the military because of the current administration's policy, and how this compares to enrollment in the military prior to this administration?
Nena may have an answer.
Actually, I saw that question earlier. I looked it up online real quick. So as of 2017, 900 DACA recipients are enrolled in the military. Numbers prior to that, numbers after that, I didn't find, but as of 2017, there are 900 DACA recipients in the military.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how do you feel California has done financially in accommodating the immigrant community on our state in terms of seniors and students? Will recent COVID-19 policy have adverse impact on our ability to provide for DACA recipients and other immigrants in California?
I'm not, first of all, I honestly believe that this DACA issue is a federal issue. It's really what the federal government that is going to be doing that is going to solve the problem once and for all anyway. So California has been relatively friendly from a policy standpoint. Not necessarily just to DACA, but overall on this issue. I may agree or disagree on some of the things that California does as well, just on this issue, but just as a disclaimer. But on DACA, I'm not sure that one way or the other what California has done that is different than the rest. Anything else, Jennifer, that you know, or Nena, that you know about California that is different than what we know?
No, not necessarily, but that's a very interesting question. I think so many things are up in the air right now, especially anything related to money is up in the air right now with the economy, COVID. So post-COVID, will California be able to afford, if I understood the question correctly, will California be able to continue funding these services that support DACA recipients? I think it's fair to say we don't know. Again, I did not come across that in my research, but a lot of things are up in the air right now with COVID-19. Unfortunately, we're not going to have a lot of answers to some of these very critical questions.
Jennifer, what does actually a state do? I mean, these folks are all employed. I mean, there's like 92% of employment rate here. Or so what is it that the question implies as far as state doing? I mean, these folks are not on a state dole the way I understand it.
I don't know how to say like financially accommodating, but I mean, there's some ways that the state of California does help current DACA recipients and other undocumented folks, you know, by, the California DREAM Act and AB 540, allowing them, to pay in-state tuition. But other than that, I can't really think of a way the state financially accommodates seniors and other students, other than providing financial aid and allowing them to pay in-state tuition.
Fair enough. I did not think about that. I'm glad you brought that up. That's great. Yes, that may be the question. Okay, very good.
Okay. So the next question is, with the decision coming at the end of June, is it too late to renew DACA at this point?
So as suggested, talk to an attorney. But as of right now, it's not too late to renew if you have the ability to renew. So I highly recommend talking to an attorney about, or an accredited Department of Justice representative. There's a lot of nonprofit organizations in Los Angeles that are actually providing the fee for folks who are renewing their DACA. So if you can, I highly recommend contacting them.
Do we know what the current origin breakdown of DACA recipients are?
I think Nena showed a graph. 80% come from Mexico, and the rest, 100 and some odd countries across.
Yes, they come from 158 countries in total, but the top 10 countries are Latin American countries, with the first one being our neighboring country, Mexico, as Professor Zerunyan said.
Have there been any discussions about about other financial requirements, example, reimbursing state federal benefits previously received by DACA recipients or their undocumented family members? Because $495 seems to be a small price to pay. Retroactive tax payments for cash earnings. What do the experts think about this question?
So I just wanted to clear, I'm not too sure how to answer the rest of the question, but I'm going to answer the first snippet about it, about $495. So this $495 is paid every 2 years. It's not just a one-time payment and you can renew it without paying each year. So folks are paying $500 every 2 years to renew their DACA. So it's not just a one-time payment. I just want to make that clear.
Right, and to add to that, and I actually should have made that clear in the presentation. Thank you, Jennifer. Also, too, I did mention in my presentation that they are USCIS or DHS, one of the two, are considered, as of November last year, they're talking about increasing that fee to almost $800. So they're talking about it, but that is a much steeper cost. And if I understood the rest of the question, I think we might need to clarify that DACA recipients do not receive federal benefits because they're not entitled to federal benefits. And they do pay taxes, which is why they have a social security number. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. All right, Frank, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all the questions. I think this has been wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Nena. Great work. Representing our student body. We're proud of you. And as we say, we're Price proud of our students. And Jennifer, you come from our school right next door physically. Gould is right next door to our school. And we interact quite a bit, of course, with your school as well on various topics. And me, of course, being kind of having my legs into your subject matter as far as a lawyer by training and also professor at the Price School. So it's a pleasure to have all of you, and I hope more people will watch this segment on various mediums that our staff may put it. But this is the kind of programming that we are proud to bring to various communities to be able to inform. Our purpose is never to be political. Our purpose is to be providing information as well as speak about both policy and law. And I hope that we have done that today. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you all in other programs. And to all of my colleagues and mayors and council members and California contract cities folks who are maybe on this call and that are going to participate to our more coming up as part of our Executive Education Forum. Thank you for being here. Look forward to seeing you all next week. And I think we got the word out, right, Harley, that we have a very special guest next week, right?
Yes, next Thursday. So
next
I hope
Thursday,
you all join us for our Price Talks next Thursday. An invitation was sent out today, and it was on our website, a USC Price Policy in the Pandemic virtual series.
That's wonderful. And if we can give a short plug, we're looking forward to having the Lieutenant Governor of the state of California next week on this Price Talk. So please do join us next week, and please share the information so that we give a rousing welcome to our Lieutenant Governor and find out how we reopen California.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.